When we have a conversation like that, if you and I were talking and you talked about, man, I got up at sunrise this morning, I'm not going to stop you and say, well, you're just an unreliable source of information. I can't trust you anymore. You just lied to me. Well, that's absurd.
You know, in a lot of your writings and a lot of your content, you know, you really tackle a lot of tough passages in the Bible, tough stories in the Bible. Like, do you believe all those stories, especially in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I'm not one who separates history and myth or thinks that something mythic is non-historical. We should unpack that a little bit. I mean, you know, along with the first question, do I believe everything in the Bible? Well, on one level, sure. But the Bible does say things, you know, and it has characters say things that aren't true. The Bible will say things that don't necessarily, you know, conform to a point of knowledge that we have. For instance, you know, the Bible talks about the firmament over the earth, you know, being hard as brass. Okay, well, there isn't a such thing, but that's ancient cosmology. It's a way of talking about the world as they experienced and thought about it, and they affirm God as creator, but there's a difference in how they talk about something as opposed to what the truth proposition is. The truth proposition is that God made everything, including humans, you know, Adam and Eve, all that. Yeah, I'm on board with that, but I recognize that a biblical writer might use a certain way of expressing an idea that really isn't the way we would do it now. You know, they were living thousands of years ago, so how would we expect them, you know, to be able to do that?
So you're talking about things like, okay, so for example, even today we would say, okay, the sun's going down or the sun is rising, but scientifically we know, well, really the earth revolves around the sun. The sun doesn't technically rise, but that's our language.
When we have a conversation like that, if you and I were talking and you talked about, man, I got up at sunrise this morning, I'm not going to stop you and say, well, you're just an unreliable source of information. I can't trust you anymore. You just lied to me. Well, that's absurd.
Right.
Okay, and we have to realize that biblical writers were, you know, drum roll please, people. Okay, they were people that God picked living at a certain time, you know, with a certain worldview, a certain body of knowledge. And they use expressions like this. They convey certain thoughts with, you know, through the filter or the lens of certain ideas, you know, that are common in their day that, you know, we wouldn't do that today for any number of reasons. But that doesn't mean that they're deceiving us. It doesn't mean that they're communicating, you know, error or falsehood. I mean, you have to sort of be able to know what in the world they're talking about. So I think all of the truth propositions of Scripture, and that's an important, you know, term. You know, what does the Bible convey to us? What does it propose to us as something that is, you know, true for all time and eternity? I think those are without error. I think they're infallible. I think that they are our guide for faith and practice. But again, we realize, because a close reader of Scripture will run into these probably in the first hour, okay, you're going to run into something that doesn't, you know, quite conform again to the way we would think today in terms of maybe the natural world or just a way of saying something. A real practical example is, you know, the Bible doesn't know anything about male infertility. If a couple can't have children, it's always the woman's fault in the Bible.
Just general term for barrenness.
Just barrenness. Yeah. Okay, and it's not applied to men. Well, why is that? Well, it's because of their conception of you know, where babies come from, you know, how we get babies. Of course, they're familiar with sex, but they use a planting metaphor to describe this. The man plants the seed. This is why we get seed terminology, okay? Plants the seed in the woman where it grows, and then she has a child. So if she's not producing a child, there's something wrong with her, because the man could say, well, I mean, I know it was deposited. I mean, you know, we had sexual relations and everything worked. And so if we don't have a kid, it's you're cursed by God, or there's something wrong with you, or whatever. And they think that way only because of the fact that they don't really know, well, there's lots of things that could go wrong on the male side. It's not just a deposition, from where we get children. We don't know anything about genetics or the whole process. How does a biblical woman know she's pregnant? Okay, the language that's used is typically there'll be something about the movement of the fetus, or after a certain number of weeks, she's with child. Well, that's not the Bible's way of saying, hey, prior to the child moving in the womb, or maybe missing your period, it's not a human, so go ahead and abort it. I mean, there are people who actually say that. There are people who will take the language of the Old Testament about how a woman knows she's pregnant and the whole process of childbirth and use that to legitimize abortion. Okay, that is not what is being affirmed in those passages. The biblical writers, again, they speak from the knowledge of experience. They know what they can experience with their own senses, in their own ancient culture. And this is how this information is conveyed to us. So for us to either sit in judgment on it, like they're wrong, or they're just giving us untruths or falsehoods, that's not only the wrong way to approach it. If we take what they say and try to draw conclusions just to suit sort of something that we want to believe or thing we want to do, and we take their language in its limited, for what it is, in its limited context, then we become manipulators of the biblical text, and that's just wrong. So I think we need to be a little more circumspect and careful about how we think about Scripture, the writers.